In 1953, South Korea was one of the poorest places on earth. The Korean War had just ended. 3 years of brutal fighting had left the country in absolute ruins. Cities had been bombed flat, farmland was scorched, infrastructure barely existed, nearly 4 million people were dead. The economy was smaller than some sub-Saharan African nations. The average South Korean earned less than $100 a year. Foreign aid, mostly American, was the only thing keeping the country from complete collapse. Experts looked at South Korea and saw nothing: no natural resources, no industrial base, a traumatized, illiterate rural population, a government propped up by foreign money, a hostile, militarized neighbor to the north that could invade again at any moment. Many development economists privately concluded that South Korea was simply too damaged, too poor, too fragile to ever build a real economy. Some called it a hopeless case. Today, South Korea is the world's 10th largest economy. Its companies, Samsung, Hyundai, LG, POSCO, are global giants. Its pop culture dominates the world. Its technology is in your pocket. Its cinema wins Oscars. Its citizens live longer, healthier lives than people in most of Western Europe. It has made the transition from aid recipient to aid donor, from economic basket case to global powerhouse within a single human lifetime. No country in history has ever grown so fast, from so little, in so short a time. This is the story of how South Korea did it, and why almost no one fully understands how extraordinary that achievement actually is. To appreciate what South Korea built, you first have to sit with what it started from. In 1945, Korea emerged from 35 years of brutal Japanese colonial rule. The Japanese had deliberately suppressed Korean industry, Korean education, and Korean economic independence. Korea was designed to be a resource colony, a supplier of rice, minerals, and cheap labor for the Japanese Empire. When Japan surrendered in 1945, it left behind a country with almost no trained engineers, no experienced managers, no indigenous industrial capacity, and an economy built entirely around serving someone else's needs. Then came the division. The artificial line drawn at the 38th parallel split the peninsula in two, separating the industrialized north, where the Japanese had built most of the factories and power plants, from the largely agricultural south. South Korea got the poverty and the people. North Korea got the infrastructure. Then came the war. When North Korean forces swept south in June 1950, they captured Seoul within 3 days. American and UN forces pushed them back. Chinese forces pushed back again, and for 3 years the peninsula was fought over with a ferocity that left almost nothing standing. Seoul changed hands 4 times. By the armistice of 1953, the capital had been reduced to rubble, and the country it nominally governed was barely functioning at all. This was the starting point, not just poor, destroyed. In 1961, a general named Park Chung-hee seized power in a military coup. Park is one of the most controversial figures in modern Asian history, a dictator who suspended democracy, imprisoned opponents, and ran a surveillance state of genuine brutality. He is also, by almost any economic measure, the man most responsible for transforming South Korea from a ruin into a powerhouse. Holding both truths simultaneously is uncomfortable. History rarely makes it easy. Park had grown up in poverty in rural Korea under Japanese occupation. He had been educated in Japanese military academies. He understood with painful clarity what it meant for a nation to be weak and what it cost. His single obsessive goal from the moment he took power was to make South Korea strong enough that it could never be dominated again. And he believed with absolute conviction that economic power was the foundation of everything else. His model was Japan, not Japanese colonialism. He had seen enough of that, but the Japanese developmental state. The idea that a strong government could direct private enterprise toward national goals, picking industries to build, channeling investment strategically, and using the full weight of state power to turn economic plans into reality. Park did not leave development to the market. He chose it, he directed it, and he enforced it. The engine of South Korea's transformation was the Chaebol. Chaebol, the word means roughly wealth clan in Korean, were large family-owned conglomerates that Park selected, nurtured, and empowered to drive industrial growth. Samsung, Hyundai, LG, Daewoo, Lotte. These were not companies that grew organically from market competition. They were chosen. Given government contracts, subsidized loans from state-controlled banks, protected from foreign competition, and pushed hard to meet ambitious export targets. In return, the Chaebol were expected to perform. Miss your export targets and the preferential loans dried up. Fail to deliver on a government contract and you risked losing your operating license entirely. The relationship between Park's government and the Chaebol was not a partnership between equals. It was a command economy wearing a market economy's clothes. The first targets were simple: textiles, shoes, wigs, labor-intensive goods that South Korea's cheap, disciplined workforce could produce competitively. Foreign exchange earned from exports was channeled back into heavier industries: steel, chemicals, shipbuilding. The story of POSCO, the Pohang Iron and Steel Company, captures the audacity of the whole enterprise. In the late 1960s, Park decided South Korea needed a world-class steel industry. International experts told him it was impossible. The World Bank refused to finance it. South Korea had no iron ore, no coking coal, no experience in steel production, and no money. Park went to Japan instead, secured reparations payments and loans, hired Japanese engineers, and built the Pohang Steel Complex from scratch. Within a decade, POSCO was one of the most efficient steel producers on Earth. The experts had been wrong. Hyundai's founder Chung Ju-young was told the same thing when he decided to build a shipyard. South Korea had no shipbuilding tradition. International orders required a demonstrated track record. Chung had neither. He secured a contract from a Greek shipping magnate by showing him a picture of the 500-year-old Gyeongbokgung Palace and arguing essentially that a people who could build anything. He broke ground on the shipyard and built the first ship simultaneously. Within 15 years, South Korea was the world's largest shipbuilder. This pattern repeated itself across industry after industry. Choose a target, mobilize resources, ignore the experts, execute with ferocious discipline, move on to the next target. The miracle had a price, and ordinary South Koreans paid most of it. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, industrial workers labored in conditions that would be unacceptable today. 12 and 14-hour shifts were standard. Unions were suppressed, sometimes violently. Wages were kept deliberately low to maintain export competitiveness. The government's logic was brutal but explicit: sacrifice now, prosperity later, investment today, consumption tomorrow. In 1970, a young textile worker named John Tae-il set himself on fire outside a market in Seoul, shouting that workers were not machines. He was 22 years old. His death became a symbol of everything the miracle cost at the human level. The hundreds of thousands of men and women whose exhaustion, whose suppressed wages, whose forfeited rights had been the invisible fuel driving South Korea's industrial furnaces. Park Chung-hee himself was assassinated in 1979, shot by the director of his own intelligence agency at a private dinner. His successor continued the authoritarianism. The Gwangju Uprising of 1980, a popular democratic revolt brutally crushed by the military, left hundreds dead and became a defining trauma in South Korean national memory.
Is eviction.
The economic miracle and the political repression were not separate stories. They were the same story. South Korea grew rich under dictatorship, and the struggle to become free was every bit as hard as the struggle to become wealthy. By the late 1980s, South Korea had grown too educated, too urbanized, and too connected to the world to be governed by military authoritarians much longer. A massive democracy movement, building for years, came to a head in 1987. Mass protests swept the cities. Unlike in 1980, the government chose not to fire on the crowds. Partly from calculation, partly from exhaustion, and partly because South Korea was hosting the 1988 Seoul Olympics, and a massacre would have been watched by the entire world. South Korea held free elections, a new democratic constitution came into force, and the economy kept growing. The 1990s brought a new phase, the move from manufacturing to technology and innovation. Samsung, which had started making black and white televisions, moved into semiconductors. By the early 2000s, Samsung was one of the world's leading chip manufacturers. LG, Hyundai, and Kia carved out global positions in electronics and automobiles. South Korean companies stopped copying foreign technology and started creating their own. The Asian financial crisis of 1997 was a brutal shock. The IMF bailout came with humiliating conditions, and companies that had seemed invincible collapsed overnight. But South Korea restructured with remarkable speed, reformed its most dysfunctional chaebol, and emerged from the crisis leaner and more competitive than before. Then came the soft power revolution no one predicted. K-pop, K-drama, Korean cinema, Bong Joon-ho's Parasite winning Best Picture at the Oscars in 2020, the global dominance of BTS, the worldwide phenomenon of Squid Game. A country that had spent decades building factories was suddenly exporting its culture to the entire world. South Korea's story does not fit neatly into any ideology. It is not a straightforward triumph of free markets. The state directed, controlled, and subsidized relentlessly. It is not a simple argument for authoritarian development. The democracy movement was real, the costs of repression were real, and the country became most innovative once it was also free. It is not a story that can be easily copied. The specific combination of historical circumstances, national culture, geopolitical context, and individual leadership that produced the Korean miracle has never been precisely replicated anywhere. What it is, undeniably, is one of the most remarkable human achievements of the 20th century. A country that had nothing, that had been colonized, divided, destroyed, and written off, that looked at the ruins and decided with extraordinary collective will to build something from them. In 1953, South Korea was receiving foreign aid to survive. Today, it gives foreign aid to others. That distance, traveled in 70 years, is one of the most astonishing journeys any nation has ever made.